Rebecca Hayes didn't expect official mail to find someone sleeping behind Morrison's Diner in East Nashville. People like her, 8 months homeless, living hand-to-mouth with a 10-year-old daughter, weren't supposed to be located by anything bearing a government seal. The invisibility was the point. But that November morning, watching a woman in a county jacket scan the alley with the methodical confusion of someone refusing to believe an address could simply not exist. Becca knew her careful erasure was ending. Emily, wrapped in the patched sleeping bag they shared, tightened her grip on Becca's arm. That gesture, the protection reflex no child should master, hurt worse than the cold seeping through Becca's jacket. Tennessee Department of Probate Services. The embossed seal caught weak morning light like a warning. The woman held the envelope the way people hold live birds, careful but committed. Margaret Hayes, her grandmother's name spoken aloud after 17 years of deliberate silence. The woman's eyes found them with the trained neutrality of someone paid not to judge circumstances. The approach came slowly, boots crunching frost and gravel. Rebecca Hayes. The name sounded foreign. Becca had spent so many months being invisible that hearing herself acknowledged felt like being caught doing something criminal. County Probate Office. The woman consulted the envelope as if verifying she hadn't made a terrible mistake. Been trying to reach you for 3 months. 3 months. The distance between late summer and the first morning, the ground froze beneath her feet. The gap between sleeping in parks and sleeping behind dumpsters when the parks closed for the season. It's about your grandmother, Margaret Hayes. She passed 2 winters ago. Estate was delayed complications with property records going back 40 years. But you're listed as sole heir. Heir to what Margaret owned a rotting shack on Silverbrook Ridge, plus 80 acres of steep Smoky Mountain woodland nobody wanted. She died poor. Everyone knew it. The county had tried taking the land for back taxes twice when Becca was still a teenager, and Margaret had fought them both times with a fury that made grown men uncomfortable. The envelope changed hands. Becca's fingers were stiff from cold and the particular exhaustion that came from never sleeping deeply enough to feel rested. She signed the delivery slip with hands that could barely hold the pen. Inside was a deed printed on heavy stock that felt expensive, permanent. The legal description meant nothing. Township numbers, range, markers, coordinates that pulsed on the page like something coded, but the address she recognized. Silverbrook Ridge Road, Sevier County, the eastern slope of the Smoky Mountains, where the elevation got serious and the winters came early and stayed late. A handwritten note was paper-clipped to the deed. County letterhead dated 3 weeks prior. Occupant rights valid. Beware structural weakness. No taxes owed until reassessment. The kind of bureaucratic warning that tried to sound helpful but carried the faint smell of liability protection. Have you ever returned to a place you swore you'd never see again? Not for nostalgia, not for closure, but because you had nowhere else left to go. Emily's face was pinched with cold, and something Becca recognized as hope, which somehow felt more dangerous. We're going. Becca couldn't call it home. Home implied welcome, warmth, belonging. But it was a destination, and after 8 months of drifting through Nashville's cruelest winter in decades, that felt like mercy enough. They gathered their things, 2 backpacks worn shiny at the stress points, the sleeping bag that smelled permanently of diesel and damp, a thrift store coat that had given up on insulation but still blocked some wind. Everything they owned fit into 2 hands. The bus to Gatlinburg left in 40 minutes. Becca counted the emergency fund. $37 in ones and quarters, enough for 2 tickets with 3 left over. Emily pressed close as they walked toward the station. The streets were filling with morning commuters, people who slept in beds and worried about traffic instead of where their next meal would come from. Becca felt like a ghost passing through the solid world. At the station, she bought the tickets from a clerk who didn't look up from his phone. The bus was half empty. They took seats in the back where the engine noise would cover conversation, and Emily could sleep without strangers watching. The city fell away behind them. Nashville's sprawl thinned into strip malls, then scattered houses, then the rolling Tennessee hills that deepened and darkened as they moved east. Emily's head found her mother's shoulder. Within 15 minutes, the exhaustion of chronic uncertainty pulling her under. Becca stayed awake, watching the landscape change. The road climbed steadily. Bare trees lined the highway like anatomical diagrams, all structure and no decoration. The sky was the color of old steel. She'd last traveled this route at 17, running from Margaret's cabin with nothing but anger and a bus ticket Linda had sent from Knoxville. She'd sworn never to return, had built a life deliberately distant from these mountains. Nursing school in Memphis, marriage to a man who'd seemed stable until the gambling debt surfaced. Emily's birth in a hospital that smelled like bleach and new beginnings. Then the divorce. The cascade of financial collapse that followed. The realization that every safety net she'd believed in was made of paper, and the first strong wind had torn it all away. Going back felt like admitting defeat, like the universe had a sense of humor, dark enough to return her to the exact place she'd fled, only now broke and desperate, instead of young and angry. The bus rattled through Sevierville, past Pigeon Forge, with its tourist traps, shuttered for the off-season into Gatlinburg, where the road began to climb seriously, and the air thinned in that way that forced honest breathing. They got off at the last stop. The old gas station at the junction of Route 441 and Silverbrook Ridge Road had closed years ago. Plywood covered the windows. Graffiti proclaimed territories and heartbreaks in equal measure. Becca shouldered both packs. Emily walked beside her without complaint, though her legs had to be aching. The child had learned not to complain about physical discomfort. There were harder things to endure than tired muscles. Silverbrook Ridge Road was gravel and mud. It climbed through second-growth forest that crowded close on both sides. The trees here were older than the ones near Nashville, thicker, darker. They stood in the particular silence of mountains in late autumn after the birds have migrated, but before the snow muffles everything into absolute quiet. What was she like, Grandma Margaret? Becca picked her words carefully. The truth was complicated, stubborn, kind in ways that didn't look like kindness. She believed the mountain taught you what you needed to learn. What did you learn? The path curved around a washout. Becca stepped over it automatically, muscle memory from childhood guiding her feet. I didn't stay long enough to find out. The lie tasted familiar. She'd learned plenty. That poverty was a trap that closed slowly enough you didn't notice until it was too late. That being right about something didn't matter if nobody believed you. That the world had no obligation to care about your truth, especially when your truth made powerful people uncomfortable. Margaret had tried to teach her those lessons. Becca had rejected them as the bitter philosophy of someone too stubborn to adapt. Now, 17 years later, she understood them in her bones. The path narrowed. Emily moved closer, small hand finding Becca's. They walked in silence for another half-mile. The forest opened gradually. Through the thinning trees, Becca saw it. The house looked exactly as bad as she'd feared, and somehow worse than memory suggested. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired spine. Boards had curled away from the frame, exposing dark gaps. The porch had surrendered to gravity, completely collapsing into a sprawl of lumber and weeds that looked almost deliberate. Windows were either missing or broken. The chimney listed slightly to the left. The whole structure seemed held upright by stubbornness and the skeletal support of its own frame. "It's really old, it is, but it's ours." They approached slowly. Each step felt like walking into the past, into a version of herself she'd tried to bury. The yard was overgrown, but not entirely wild. Someone had mowed at some point in the last year. The grass was short enough to see the ground. Becca reached the front door and stopped. It was closed, but not locked. The handle turned easily, too easily. The hinges had been oiled recently. She could smell it, 3-in-1 oil, the kind Margaret used to keep in the kitchen for every squeaking hinge and sticky drawer. The door swung inward without protest. Inside, dust drifted in shafts of late afternoon light, but not thick dust, not the accumulated sediment of 2 years' abandonment. The floors were swept, the corners were clear. Someone had been here recently regularly. The living room still held Margaret's rocking chair. The runners cracked, but the frame solid. A cast-iron stove hunched in the corner, its surface clean of rust. The air smelled of old wood and something else. Time. The wild thyme Margaret used to hang in bundles from the ceiling beams. It's like a story, one with ghosts. Becca set the packs down near the stove. Maybe, but we're the living ones here. The kitchen was through a doorway that had never had a door. The counter was rough-hewn wood, worn smooth by decades of use. A dry sink, a hand pump that probably didn't work. Shelves with a few dusty mason jars still lined up like soldiers. Becca tried the pump. It resisted, then gave. Water coughed out brown, then cleared, cold and mineral sharp. Someone had kept the well maintained. She opened drawers mechanically, looking for proof of occupancy, evidence of life. The third drawer stuck. Becca worked it gently until it slid open. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. Heavy stock, the kind Margaret saved from important letters and reused for her own purposes. Becca unfolded it with hands that wanted to shake. The handwriting was unmistakable. Margaret's cramped, deliberate script the letters formed with arthritic fingers but absolute intention. If you're reading this, you've found your way back. The mountain keeps secrets in stone. Linda knew, but chose differently. You'll have to choose too. Nothing else. No explanation. No sentiment. Pure Margaret. Say what needs saying, nothing more. Becca tucked the note into her pocket. Her chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Linda knew, but chose differently. What had her mother known? What choice had she made? "Mom, there's wood for the stove." A stack of split firewood sat beside the cast-iron stove. Dry recently, split the cut surfaces. Still pale. Becca stared at it. Margaret had been dead for 2 years. Someone was maintaining this house, oiling hinges, splitting wood, keeping the well clear. But what Becca didn't know, what the trunk couldn't tell her, was that her mother Linda had stood in this same house 15 years ago, holding the same choice Margaret now passed to Becca. And Linda had walked away. Some inheritances aren't land or money. They're unfinished battles waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to pick up the sword. They built a fire. The first match caught quickly. The kindling took with the eager hunger of dry wood and cold air. Within minutes, warmth began seeping into the room. Emily pulled the sleeping bag close to the stove and sat cross-legged, soaking in heat, like a plant, leaning toward sunlight. Becca found candles in a kitchen cabinet, 3 thick pillars barely used. She lit them as darkness pressed against the windows. The house transformed in candlelight. Shadows softened the decay. The worn surfaces looked lived in, rather than abandoned. She explored while Emily warmed herself. The hallway behind the kitchen was narrow and creaky. Each board announced her weight with sounds that ranged from whisper to complaint. At the end of the hall was the bedroom she'd shared with her mother during the brief years they'd lived here, before Linda decided the mountains were suffocating and dragged 7-year-old Becca to Knoxville in search of something better that never materialized. The iron bed frame was still there. A quilt faded to the color of old newsprint covered the mattress. Dust lay thick on the windowsill, but the floor had been swept. The same pattern. Recent maintenance. Deliberate care. Becca approached the closet slowly. The door stuck swollen with humidity and age. She pulled harder. It gave with a groan. Inside, beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets, sat an old trunk. Becca had never seen it before. The lock was broken, hanging loose from rusted hinges. She lifted the lid. Linda's belongings, clothes Becca recognized from childhood. A jewelry box with cheap costume pieces, stacks of letters bound with rubber bands, and, beneath it all, folded carefully, a hand-drawn map on yellowed paper. Becca spread it across the bed. The map showed property boundaries in meticulous detail with annotations in Linda's handwriting. Silverbrook Ridge, north boundary, East Creek, and, in the northeast corner, past a notation reading, Marker 7. Someone had drawn a small square building with the words, Stone Building, check here. Her mother had known about something hidden on this property, had drawn a map to find it, and then, what? Left kept silent. Becca's hands were shaking. She dug deeper into the trunk, found a stack of journals. Linda's journals, the earliest dated 1998, when Becca was 7, the latest from 2005, 4 years before Linda died. She opened the 2001 journal at random. The entry was dated March 15th. Mom showed me the stone building today, made me swear never to tell. I'm scared for her. She's obsessed. Says Summit Mining stole from us from everyone. Says she has proof. But who's going to believe a crazy old woman in the mountains? I love her, but sometimes I think she's lost in her own head. Becca flipped forward. October 2001. They offered me $50,000. $50,000 to sign an NDA and forget what I saw. Summit Mining's lawyer came to my apartment in Knoxville. Knew exactly where I lived, what I needed. Said it was compensation for any inconvenience my mother's unfounded accusations may have caused. Becca needs college. I'm drowning in debt. Mom says I'm betraying her. Maybe I am, but I'm choosing my daughter. Becca's vision blurred. Her mother had taken money, had been bought off. The nursing school tuition she'd always assumed came from student loans, and Linda's secretarial work had actually come from Summit Mining's hush money. She flipped to 2003. January used the last of the Summit money for Becca's final semester. She graduates in May. Mom won't speak to me. I've driven up 3 times. Sheila won't answer the door. Maybe some prices are too high. But Becca has a future now. That has to count for something. The final entry was dated April 2005. Went to see Mom one last time. Told her I was sick. Stage 4, ovarian. She didn't say anything for 10 minutes. Then, "You made your choice. Now live with it." "I'm dying, and she can't forgive me. Maybe I don't deserve forgiveness. I chose Becca over truth. I'd make the same choice again, but I'm leaving this trunk. Someday, someone will need to know what I knew, what I was too afraid to fight for." Becca sat on the edge of the bed, journals clutched to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Her mother had died estranged from Margaret because she'd chosen Becca's education over Margaret's fight. The tuition money that launched Becca's nursing career had been blood money, silence money. Outside, something moved, a sound like boots on gravel. Becca froze, listening. The sound came again. Footsteps deliberate, circling the house. She moved to the window, careful to stay in shadow. In the moonlight, she could see fresh footprints in the mud, large, size 13 work boots based on the tread pattern, leading from the tree line to the bedroom window, stopping directly below where she stood. Someone had been watching. Recently, tonight, Becca's heart hammered. She checked the rest of the house, moving quietly. The kitchen window, locked when they had arrived, was now open an inch, just enough to slip fingers through and lift. Fresh boot prints marked the kitchen floor. Mud recent leading from the back door to the hallway to the bedroom. Someone had been inside the house while she'd been exploring. Had stood in that bedroom. Had looked at Emily, sleeping by the stove. Becca grabbed the poker from beside the stove. She sat in Margaret's rocking chair facing the door and didn't sleep. Morning arrived with the kind of cold that made breathing hurt. Becca had been awake all night, every sound sending adrenaline spiking through her exhausted system. Emily woke, slowly noticed her mother's rigid posture without comment. 8 months homeless had taught her to read danger in silence. The knock came at 7:30. Becca approached the door with the poker still in hand. Through the window, she could see a man. Tall, weathered face, 65 maybe. He was carrying an armload of firewood. "Margaret was my friend." His voice carried through the door, calm, non-threatening. "Been keeping the place ready in case anyone came. Name's James Cross." Becca opened the door a crack. James Cross looked like someone the mountains had worn smooth instead of broken. "Retired firefighter," he explained. "Lived half a mile down the ridge. Had promised Margaret he'd watch the property. Your grandma tried telling people for 30 years. Nobody listened because she had no proof they couldn't destroy." What kind of proof? James set the firewood down carefully. She had a map, drew it herself from memory. "Made me promise if anything happened, I'd make sure her heir found the stone building past Marker 7. "You find that map yet?" Becca showed him Linda's map from the trunk. James nodded slowly, recognition and something like relief crossing his face. "Linda came back once. Must have been 2009, maybe 10. Her and Margaret had words I could hear from the road. Linda left crying. Never saw her again." He paused, choosing words carefully. "Your mama made a choice. Margaret never blamed her, but never forgave her either. Some things don't allow for both." What choice? James's eyes said he knew more than he was saying, the kind of knowing that comes from keeping secrets for people who are dead. "That's your story to discover. But I'll tell you this, whatever Margaret hid, it was worth enough that Summit Mining's been watching this property for 2 years, waiting to see who'd show up. The boot prints. You see anyone last night?" James's face darkened. "Big man, drives a dark sedan, parks on the access road, sometimes watches the house. I've run him off twice, but he keeps coming back. You're gonna need help. Legal help." Before Becca could respond, another vehicle pulled up. A young man climbed out, camera bag over his shoulder. Brandon Parker, 28, maybe 30. The kind of eager energy that made Becca instantly wary. Heard Margaret Hayes' granddaughter showed up. Brandon offered a hand. Becca didn't take. I'm with the Gatlinburg Gazette. Been researching local mining history. Summit Mining's got an interesting past around here. He pulled out a notebook. Closed operations last year. Company's been extracting lithium from these mountains since the 80s. Made a fortune. But the timelines never quite added up for me. Becca crossed her arms. I didn't ask for a reporter. Brandon's smile didn't fade, but something sharper entered his eyes. Fair. But if you find anything worth telling, I'd want to hear it first. Because if Summit's paying attention to this property, there's a reason. And reasons make good stories. He left a business card on the porch railing and drove away. James waited until the sound of the engine faded. He's not wrong. Summit doesn't waste resources watching abandoned shacks. Whatever Margaret hid, they want it buried. Permanently. The next morning, James returned with a thermos of coffee and a county trail map. If you're going up to Marker 7, you don't go alone. And you leave Emily somewhere safe. Rachel, James's wife, agreed to watch Emily at their house down the ridge. The little girl went without protest, understanding, in the way children of crisis do, that some things required adult handling. Becca and James hiked in silence for the first half-mile. The trail was narrow, overgrown, marked only by occasional blazes on trees. James moved with the confidence of someone who'd walked these woods 10,000 times. Margaret wasn't crazy. His voice came quiet, matter-of-fact. She was early. There's a difference people don't understand till it's too late. He told stories as they climbed, about Margaret fighting the county over back taxes, about her showing up at commission meetings with hand-drawn maps and accusations that made officials uncomfortable, about the way people stopped listening, not because she was wrong, but because being right would cost them something. Your mama loved you more than truth. That's not weakness. That's just a different kind of strength. The trail steepened. Becca's legs burned. Her breath came in sharp gasps. She was out of shape, her body still recovering from months of inadequate nutrition and poor sleep. Linda took money from Summit back in 2001. James said it without judgment, just stating fact. 50,000. Margaret found out, cut her off. Linda used the money for your nursing school. Becca stopped walking. What James turned patient. Margaret knew. Never told you because she didn't want you carrying that weight. But you ought to know choices aren't simple as right and wrong. Linda chose you. Margaret chose her fight. Both paid for it. They reached Marker 7 an hour later. A weathered wooden post with a rusted metal tag stamped with the number 7. The official boundary of Margaret's 80 acres. James pointed northeast. Buildings about 200 yards that direction. Paths faint. Stay close. They pushed through undergrowth. Branches caught at Becca's coat. The ground was uneven rocks, hidden under leaves, waiting to turn an ankle. Then the trees opened into a small clearing. The stone building stood in the center, maybe 10 by 12 feet. Old, older than the house. The kind of construction that predated modern tools. Hand-cut stone fitted together with the patience of people who measured time differently. The wooden door hung slightly crooked. Deep scratches marked its surface. Not weather damage. Someone had tried to get in recently with metal tools. The gouges were fresh, the wood pale where it had been cut. Becca approached slowly. The door had a simple latch, rusted but functional. She lifted it. The door swung inward with a groan of metal and wood that hadn't moved in decades. The smell hit first. Damp wood rust, and underneath something else. Metallic, faintly sweet like minerals dissolved in water that had sat too long. She raised her phone's flashlight. The beam cut across a room stacked floor to ceiling with wooden crates. Military style, stamped with faded logos and text. Summit Mining Corporation, Confidential, 1987. James stood in the doorway, backlit, his shadow falling across the crates. This is what Margaret hid. This is why she fought. Becca stepped inside. The nearest crate bore markings she could still read despite decades of fade. She found a rusted crowbar leaning against the wall, wedged it under the crate's lid. The wood resisted, then cracked. Nails screamed as they pulled free. Inside, wrapped in canvas that had kept them protected for decades, were metal cylinders, dozens of them, each about 18 inches long, 2 inches in diameter, heavy. She lifted one carefully. It was warm, not room temperature. Genuinely warm, like it held some internal heat source. Stamped into the metal cap were numbers. A date, March 15th, 1987, and coordinates, not at addresses, geographic coordinates in degrees and minutes. She unwrapped another cylinder. Same type, different date, different coordinates. Core samples. James's voice was quiet. Geological surveys, drill cores taken from deep underground, the kind mining companies use to assess mineral deposits. Becca stared at the crates stacked to the ceiling, at the Summit Mining logo repeated on box after box. Margaret had been right about the drilling, about the trespass, about all of it, and she'd hidden the proof in a place nobody would find it until Becca came home. Hidden in one of the crates beneath layers of core samples was a sealed envelope. The paper was thick, expensive. Addressed in Linda's handwriting, "To whoever finds this." Becca's hands trembled as she broke the seal. "I'm writing this because Margaret won't. Summit Mining drilled on our land illegally in 1987. Found lithium worth millions. Mom gathered proof, hid it here. They offered me $50,000 to stay quiet about what I knew. I took it. I needed the money for Becca's education. I told myself I was protecting my daughter. Maybe I was. Maybe I was just weak. If you're reading this, you've found what Mom died trying to protect. Don't make my mistake. Don't let them win twice." The letter was dated October 2001, the same month as the journal entry. Behind her footsteps, fast, deliberate. Not James. Becca spun. Through the open door in the forest beyond the clearing, a flashlight beam cut through the trees. Then another from a different direction. James grabbed her arm. "We gotta move. Now." A male voice carried through the woods, speaking into a radio or phone. They found it. Both of them. Becca shoved 3 core samples into her coat pockets. The weight dragged at her like guilt. She and James ran. The flashlight beams swung toward them, too far to illuminate but close enough to track movement. Becca's lungs burned. The core samples banged against her ribs with each step. Behind them, she heard a second voice. "Flank, left. Don't let them reach the main trail." James knew the terrain. He led them not down toward the main trail, but east along a deer path, so faint Becca would have missed it completely. They crashed through underbrush branches, whipping across her face. The house appeared below through the trees, warm light from the candles visible through the windows. James stopped at the tree line, breathing hard. "Go. Get inside. Lock everything. I'll lead them off." Before Becca could protest, he veered north, making noise, deliberately drawing the pursuit away from the house. Becca ran to the front door. It was still unlocked, exactly as she'd left it. She slipped inside, closed it, locked it with the old bolt that probably wouldn't stop anyone determined. Her hand shook as she checked the windows. Nothing. The forest was dark and silent again. She checked the back of the house. The kitchen window that had been open an inch yesterday was fully closed now. But fresh boot prints marked the kitchen floor again. Mud. Recent. leading from the back door to the hallway to the bedroom where Emily had been sleeping that morning before going to James and Rachel's. Someone had been here, in the house, while she was gone. Becca's vision tunneled. She ran to the phone James had insisted she take, called his cell. No answer. Called Rachel's landline. Emily's fine. Rachel's voice was calm, soothing. Safe here with me. James radioed 10 minutes ago. He's okay. Lost them in the old quarry section. He'll be home soon. Becca sank into Margaret's rocking chair, core samples heavy in her pockets. Someone had been watching them, had followed them to the stone building, had searched the house while they were gone. This wasn't over. It was barely beginning. The next morning, James drove Becca to Gatlinburg Library. Dr. Robert Coleman came here Tuesdays for what the librarian called map days. Retired geology professor from University of Tennessee. 73 years old, tall and stooped from decades of peering at things smaller than they should be. James made introductions. Coleman approached the core sample like it was a religious artifact, lifted it carefully, turned it toward the window light. His fingers traced the stamped numbers with practiced familiarity. Spodumene. See this pale band, lithium-bearing mineral. He rotated the cylinder slowly, holding it to the light, like a jeweler examining a diamond, high grade, maybe 1.5% lithium content. Beautiful specimen. His voice carried detached appreciation, but his hands trembled slightly. Do you know what lithium was worth in 1987? Almost nothing. Electric car batteries didn't exist. Grid-scale storage was science fiction. This mineral was industrial waste. He set the core down with exaggerated care. Do you know what it's worth now? $80,000 per ton. The number hung in the air like something physical. Coleman pulled out a geological survey map of Sevier County, spread it across the table with reverence. Where exactly did you find this? Becca pointed to the approximate location of the stone building. Coleman measured coordinates with a ruler cross-referenced with the numbers stamped on the core sample. His face went white. This coordinate is 400 feet north of Summit Mining's lease boundary. He looked up at Becca with something approaching awe. They drilled on your grandmother's land, illegally. His finger traced property lines, and they found one of the richest lithium deposits in the eastern United States. Emily had been silent throughout, but now she moved closer to study the map. How much is under our land? Coleman did rapid calculations on a notepad. Numbers accumulated with terrifying speed. Your grandmother owned 80 acres. Based on this core depth and lithium content, I'd estimate 2 to 3 million tons of recoverable ore. He wrote a final figure and pushed it toward Becca. Current market value somewhere between $160 and $240 million. The room tilted. Becca gripped the table edge. Coleman's voice was steady, clinical. Your grandmother was sitting on a fortune, and Summit Mining stole it. The word should have brought triumph, vindication for Margaret's decades of accusations. Instead, Becca felt the weight of understanding settle across her shoulders. People had followed them last night. Someone had maintained that property for 2 years, keeping it ready, waiting for this. For evidence worth more than most people saw in 10 lifetimes. Coleman was already moving, gathering maps, pulling reference books from shelves. You need legal representation, someone willing to fight a corporation with deep pockets and no conscience. He scribbled an address on scrap paper. Catherine Brooks, best litigation attorney in 3 counties, handles cases on contingency, which means you don't pay unless you win. The address was local, a converted Victorian on Oak Street. Coleman's eyes were bright with something Becca recognized as righteous anger. Margaret tried to tell people 30 years ago. Nobody listened because she had no proof they couldn't destroy or discredit. He tapped the core sample. Now you have proof. Don't let them silence you the way they silenced her. The walk to Catherine Brooks's office took 10 minutes. The Victorian sat behind a hand-painted sign, "Walk-ins welcome. Justice doesn't keep office hours." The front porch doubled as a waiting room, empty at midday. Inside smelled of coffee and old wood. A woman in her early 40s sat behind a desk, buried under case files. Dark hair pulled into a severe bun, eyes that assessed Becca and Emily with clinical efficiency. Catherine Brooks didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Sit. Tell me everything." Becca laid out the sequence: the inheritance, the stone building, the crates stamped with Summit Mining logos, Coleman's analysis, the men in the forest, the boot prints in the house. She produced the core sample. Catherine examined it without touching. "Dr. Coleman sent you?" "Yes. Then the mineral analysis is solid. He's the best we've got." Catherine pulled a yellow legal pad from a drawer, started taking notes in shorthand that looked like encryption. "Mineral trespass. Statute of limitations is 10 years from discovery. You discovered it 3 days ago. Clock starts now." She leaned back, fingers steepled. "Summit Mining Corporation. Current market capitalization $4.8 billion. Their Tennessee lithium operation generates $600 million in annual revenue." The numbers were delivered flatly, without emphasis. Just facts that needed stating, built entirely on reserves they extracted from land they didn't own. Catherine slid a contract across the desk. "I work on contingency. If we win or reach settlement, I take 33%. If we lose, you owe nothing." She tapped the core sample with one manicured nail. "But this has teeth. Real teeth. Are you prepared for what that means? Tell me. Summit will fight. They'll claim the samples are forged, the coordinates falsified. Your grandmother was mentally incompetent. They have lawyers whose only job is making problems disappear." Catherine's expression hardened. "They'll investigate you, dig into every mistake you've made, every vulnerability. They'll use your homelessness, your divorce, anything that makes you look unstable or desperate." She glanced at Emily. "They'll question whether you're a fit parent, whether you're using your daughter to gain sympathy." The threat was delivered clinically, but Becca felt it like a physical blow. "Can they take her?" "Not if we're prepared. Not if we document everything, follow every rule, and build a case so airtight they can't find oxygen." Catherine pushed the contract closer. "I've been waiting 15 years for a case like this. A clear villain compelling facts and a plaintiff whose story matters." She met Becca's eyes. "But I need to know you won't break, because they will come at you with everything they have, and I mean everything." Becca thought about the boot prints by Emily's bed, the men in the forest, the 2 years someone had watched that house waiting. They already started. "I'm still here." Something fierce crossed Catherine's face. "Good. Then we won't waste time pretending this is civil." Becca signed the contract. Her handwriting looked shaky next to Catherine's precise signature, but it was legally binding. Catherine immediately began organizing. She drafted a statement for Becca to sign, contacted Coleman about providing expert testimony, started building a timeline of Summit's operations in the area. "We need more than one core sample. We need to document everything in that building before Summit can claim it's contaminated evidence." She grabbed her phone. "I'm calling the county sheriff. We'll get those crates photographed and cataloged today. Official record before anything disappears." The next 3 weeks blurred into depositions, document reviews, meetings with people whose expertise Becca barely understood. Coleman prepared a 47-page technical analysis of the core samples, complete with mineralogical assays and geographic surveys proving the drilling occurred outside Summit's lease. Sarah Mitchell, the librarian, produced meeting minutes from a county commission hearing in 1987. Margaret's name appeared 3 times. Each mention dismissed her claims as unsubstantiated and lacking credible evidence. The commission had voted unanimously to take no action. Sarah personally apologized, her voice thick with regret. "We should have listened." Then Donald Miller appeared. 72 years old, spine curved from decades of manual labor, hands gnarled with arthritis. He walked into Catherine's office on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a ledger so old the binding had disintegrated into loose pages. "I was a drill technician for Summit. 35 years. His voice was gravel and regret. "I kept records they told me to destroy." The ledger contained daily logs of drilling operations, dates, locations, depth supervisors, technical details that meant nothing to Becca but made Catherine's eyes go wide. Donald pointed to entries from March 1987. Off-lease drilling, Hayes property, 340 feet. The dates matched the core samples exactly. In the margin, handwritten in faded pencil, were initials. DM, supervisor ordered silence, said we'd all be terminated if word got out. His hand shook as he turned to another page. More entries, more coordinates that fell outside Summit's legal boundaries. "I had a wife, kids in school. I needed the job." Donald looked at Becca directly. "Margaret Hayes came to the drilling site once, demanded to know what we were doing. Security ran her off, called her crazy." His jaw set. "I'm 72, stage 3 lung cancer. I'm not scared anymore." He pushed the ledger toward Catherine. "Margaret died alone. People called her paranoid. That's on me. I knew she was right and said nothing. Now I'm going to make it right." Catherine's response was immediate. She drafted Donald's sworn affidavit, had it notarized the same day, added it to the evidence file that was growing thicker daily. Summit's response came within a week, a stack of legal documents 4 inches thick. Denials of every allegation. Claims that the core samples were forgeries, the coordinates fabricated, the ledger a crude attempt at fraud. Stephen Walsh, lead attorney, requested an immediate dismissal hearing. The county courthouse was newer than the library, but carried the same institutional smell, bleach and bureaucracy. The hearing room was small, designed for preliminary motions rather than full trials. Walsh arrived with 2 junior attorneys and a paralegal carrying 3 briefcases. He was 51, silver-haired, the kind of face that photographed well and projected competence. His suit probably cost more than Becca had earned in 6 months of nursing. Judge Patricia Calloway presided with the exhausted patience of someone who'd seen every variation of corporate malfeasance and stopped being surprised. Walsh's opening was smooth, practiced. "Your Honor, Margaret Hayes was a troubled woman who harassed Summit for decades. Multiple county officials can testify to her erratic behavior, unfounded accusations." He positioned Margaret as mentally unstable, suggested the core samples had been planted recently, implied that Becca was exploiting her grandmother's condition for financial gain. These core samples, allegedly 37 years old, were conveniently discovered days after Mrs. Hayes' granddaughter, recently homeless and desperate, inherited worthless property. The timing is suspicious at best, fraudulent at worst. Catherine rose slowly. When she spoke, her voice carried none of Walsh's polish, but had something harder underneath. Poverty isn't mental illness, Your Honor. It's what happens when corporations steal from the powerless and then gaslight them when they fight back. She presented Coleman's analysis, Donald's ledger, the county meeting minutes showing Margaret's claims were dismissed without investigation. Summit wants this dismissed because discovery will expose 30 years of systematic theft. They're not protecting their reputation. They're protecting their profits. Walsh tried objecting. Catherine talked over him. My client has physical evidence, expert testimony, eyewitness accounts from Summit's own employee. Mr. Walsh has implications and character assassination. Judge Calloway studied the evidence for 10 minutes. The courtroom was silent except for the clock above the bench, ticking toward a decision that would determine whether Becca's fight ended before it began. Finally, Calloway looked up. Motion to dismiss is denied. This case proceeds to discovery. Her voice was flat final. Summit Mining will provide all records of drilling operations in Sevier County from 1985 to 1995, including, but not limited to drill logs, geological surveys, internal communications regarding lease boundaries, and financial records related to lithium extraction. The gavel fell with a sound like a gunshot in the small room. Walsh's face remained neutral, but something cold flickered in his eyes as he passed Becca on his way out. The look wasn't a threat, it was a promise. That evening, Emily asked the question Becca had been dreading. When can we go home soon, baby? But Becca knew the truth. They'd just declared war on a corporation worth billions. The house on Silverbrook Ridge wasn't home anymore. It was a battlefield. Catherine's voice was quiet, but firm when they spoke privately. You understand what you've started. This doesn't end with a settlement offer. This ends with them trying to destroy you. Becca met her eyes. They already tried. I'm still standing. The next morning, driving to check on the house, Emily noticed it first. Mom, that car's been behind us since town. Becca checked the rear-view mirror. A dark sedan nondescript following at exactly the legal distance. She took an unnecessary turn. The sedan followed. Another turn. Still there. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. The borrowed truck from James rattled over the rutted mountain road. The sedan maintained position. It followed them all the way to Silverbrook Ridge Road, then stopped at the junction. Didn't follow onto the private drive, just watched. Made sure Becca knew she was being observed. Are we safe? Becca wanted to lie, wanted to promise her daughter the safety every child deserved. But Emily had survived 8 months homeless by learning to recognize truth from comfortable fiction. We will be, I promise. But Becca didn't know if that was a promise she could keep. She only knew that some fights weren't about winning. They were about refusing to surrender. And Margaret had taught her that much, at least. Some truths demanded telling, regardless of personal cost. Not because the telling would be rewarded, but because silence was corrosion that ate away at the foundation of what it meant to live with integrity. The mountains rose around them, ancient and patient, holding secrets in stone. And now those secrets belonged to Becca, whether she wanted them or not. The tire blew 4 days after the dismissal hearing. Becca pulled the borrowed truck onto the shoulder, cursing under her breath. Emily stayed silent in the passenger seat, that practiced stillness that came from knowing when to make herself small. The damage wasn't wear, not a puncture from road debris. A 4-inch nail driven straight through the tread at a perfect 90-degree angle, deliberate as a signature. Becca walked the shoulder, found 5 more nails, placed at even intervals across the gravel where the road narrowed. Someone had laid them like a trap, knowing exactly where vehicles would track. Someone put those there. Emily's voice was small, but certain, the kind of certainty that came from reading danger in patterns adults tried to pretend were random. Becca photographed everything with her phone, documented the spacing, the angles, the identical placement, called the sheriff's non-emergency line, and waited 40 minutes for the same deputy who'd responded to the boot prints. He examined the nails without touching them, his face carefully blank. Could be kids. Happens sometimes. His eyes told a different story. He knew exactly what this was and couldn't do anything about it. You should consider relocating until your legal situation resolves. I can't protect you out here. The translation was clear. You're making powerful people uncomfortable, and you're on your own. Catherine's reaction was immediate when Becca called. Document everything, every nail, every measurement, every word that deputy said. We're building a pattern, but patterns required repetition, and Becca didn't want to wait for the next incident. 4 days later, they returned from a meeting with Coleman to find the bedroom window destroyed, not cracked from a branch or weather, completely shattered glass scattered across the floor in a spray pattern that suggested deliberate force, something thrown hard from outside. Nothing was stolen. That would have been simpler, more explicable. Instead, someone had walked through every room with methodical purpose. Drawers hung open. Closet doors stood ajar. The search had been professional, unhurried. Fresh boot prints throughout the house. Size 13, same distinctive tread pattern as before. Kitchen to hallway to bedroom. The trail stopped at Emily's bed, where she'd slept, before going to Rachel's. Becca called Catherine first, this time, then the sheriff. The deputy who responded was different, older, less willing to pretend this was random mischief. You filed a restraining order against who? Becca's voice came out sharper than intended. I don't know who they are. The deputy shifted his weight, uncomfortable. Just be careful, ma'am. That night, Emily woke, screaming. Becca found her daughter tangled in the sleeping bag, eyes wide and unseeing, trapped in some nightmare where the men who searched the house had come back for her. It's okay, baby. We're safe. We're locked in. But Emily's body stayed rigid, hypervigilant even in sleep. She refused to return to bed, insisted on sleeping in the living room where she could see both doors. Becca sat in Margaret's rocking chair until dawn, watching her daughter's fitful sleep, feeling the weight of her choice settle deeper into her bones. Every decision to keep fighting was also a decision to keep Emily afraid. School started the following week. Gatlinburg Elementary, small enough that everyone knew everyone, and news traveled fast. Emily made one friend by the second day. Ashley Thompson, 9 years old, quiet like Emily, carrying her own wariness. The playdate invitation came through Ashley's mother, delivered with careful politeness at pickup. Kenneth Thompson stood beside his wife, tall and weathered, the kind of man whose hands told stories about manual labor and hard winters. He worked Summit's processing plant. Becca saw the recognition flicker across his face when she introduced herself. The connection made the battle lines drawn without either of them acknowledging it directly. Ashley's lovely. Emily needs friends. Kenneth's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Heard about your case. Hope you know what you're doing. Lot of families depend on Summit paychecks. The words were neutral, the message clear. Your fight affects more than just you. At the play date, 3 days later, Becca met Kenneth again. The tension was thicker this time, less masked by pleasantries. "My dad says his job might go away because of you." Ashley's voice carried from the other room, innocent and devastating. "Is that true?" Emily's response was too quiet to hear, but when Becca picked her up an hour later, her daughter's face was pinched with guilt she had no business carrying. That night, Emily asked the question that had been building. If we win, do Ashley's family lose their house? Becca had no good answer. The truth was complicated, full of nuance about corporate responsibility and stolen resources and justice delayed. But Emily was 10, and 10-year-olds needed clearer answers than Becca could provide. "I don't know, baby. Sometimes doing the right thing hurts people who don't deserve it." Emily absorbed this in silence, the weight of adult complications settling on shoulders too small to carry them. The electricity cut off 3 days later. Becca called the utility company, was informed of an outstanding balance, $840. "I paid that 2 weeks ago. Our records show non-payment." The voice on the phone was pleasant, unhelpful. "Service restoration requires 7 to 10 business days after balance clears." Catherine made calls, discovered the payment had been misrouted through a system error that looked less like error and more like deliberate sabotage. Demanded immediate restoration, got promises that turned into nothing. They lived without power. Wood stove for heat, candles for light, the hand pump for water. Emily adapted with the resilience of children who'd survived worse, but Becca watched the fear creeping back into her daughter's eyes. The hyper-vigilance that had started to fade during their first weeks in the house, returning with doubled intensity. The black pickup appeared on a Wednesday afternoon. Emily was walking home from the bus stop, the mile-long stretch of gravel road she'd traveled alone since school started. Becca learned about it when Emily burst through the door 20 minutes early, running out of breath, terrified. The truck had driven beside her, matching her pace. The passenger window rolled down. A man's voice, not unkind, but deliberate. "Tell your mom smart people take the money. Kids need safe places, not courtrooms." Then the truck accelerated away before Emily could see the license plate or the driver's face clearly. Becca called Catherine, then the sheriff, then the FBI field office in Knoxville. Witness intimidation was a federal crime, Catherine explained, her voice tight with controlled rage. This crossed a line they can't walk back from. Agent Laura Voss arrived within 2 hours, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, carrying the particular weariness of someone who'd spent 2 decades watching powerful people avoid consequences. She took Emily's statement with gentle efficiency, documented the vehicle description, the exact words spoken, the time and location, promised investigation with the kind of certainty that should have been comforting but felt hollow against the reality of a 10-year-old too scared to walk home from school. The truck returned 2 days later. Didn't approach, didn't threaten, just parked at the end of Silverbrook Ridge Road, where it was visible from the house watching. A reminder that promises of investigation meant nothing against the reality of being watched. Emily's breaking point came that night. She stood in the kitchen, small and shaking, tears streaming down her face. "Mama, I'm scared. Can we just take the money and leave?" Becca knelt eye level with her daughter. "Do you want me to stop fighting?" Emily's face crumpled. "I want to stop being afraid." The choice crystallized in that moment. Margaret's vindication versus Emily's childhood. Truth versus safety. Justice versus peace. Becca held her daughter and didn't make promises she couldn't keep. Brandon Parker's investigation had been running parallel to Catherine's case, driven by journalist instinct that told him Summit's timeline didn't align with their public statements. He'd been digging for weeks, cultivating sources, following financial trails that led to offshore accounts and shell companies. The breakthrough came from an anonymous source, a USB drive left in his mailbox containing internal Summit documents dating back to 1987. Memos, executive emails, geological surveys that had never been filed with the county. Brandon verified the documents with a forensic expert. Authentic, unaltered, explosive. The memos showed executives discussing the Hayes property specifically, coordinates that matched the core samples Becca had found, instructions to proceed with extraction despite lease boundaries, orders to manage Margaret Hayes quietly, to discredit her claims before they gained traction. Brandon wanted to publish immediately. Catherine stopped him with a phone call that stretched past midnight. Not yet. We need criminal investigation first, or they'll claim defamation and bury everything in litigation. I'm a journalist. My job is publishing truth. Your job is publishing truth that survives long enough to matter. Catherine's voice carried steel beneath the exhaustion. Give me 2 weeks. Let the FBI build their case, then publish everything, and I'll make sure it sticks. Brandon agreed reluctantly, understanding that timing was the difference between a story that changed things and a story that got buried under legal threats. George Blackwood found Becca in the Gatlinburg grocery store, approached with the hesitant shuffle of someone carrying decades of guilt. I knew your grandmother. I owe you truth. He'd been mayor from 1995 to 2005, the years when Margaret's claims had been most vocal, most public, most dismissed. Summit approached me in 1998, offered $100,000 to use mayoral influence to discredit her claims. His face was weathered eyes, haunted. My daughter had leukemia. Treatment cost more than I could earn in 5 years. I took the money. The confession came without self-pity, just the flat acknowledgement of choices made under pressure that felt unbearable at the time. Margaret was right about everything. I knew it. I helped bury it anyway. He handed Becca a manila folder thick with documents. Internal Summit correspondence from 1998. Copies he'd kept as insurance, as evidence of his own complicity. My daughter survived. Graduated college, got married, has kids now. I bought her life with your grandmother's reputation. Why now? George met her eyes directly. Because I'm 67 with congestive heart failure, don't have long, and I'd like to die, knowing I did one thing right. The documents went into Catherine's evidence file. Another piece of the pattern, another layer of proof that Summit's theft hadn't been accidental or isolated, but systematic, deliberate, protected by people who should have been protecting the community instead. James told the story over coffee one morning while Emily was at school, about loving Margaret in the way of mountain people who showed devotion through action rather than words, about helping her hide the crates in 1987 because he trusted her even when he thought she was wrong. I loved your grandmother, never told her, both too stubborn to admit feelings that made us vulnerable. He'd realized she was right sometime in the early 90s when Summit's stock price jumped on news of lithium discoveries that came from coordinates he recognized, tried to help her go public. She refused, said she didn't have enough proof yet, needed more time to build an unassailable case. By the time she had proof, the narrative was already set. Crazy old woman in the mountains making wild accusations. No amount of evidence could shift a story people had already decided to believe. Did she regret fighting James's answer? Came slowly measured, every single day. But she regretted the thought of stopping even more. Some people are built to surrender. Margaret wasn't one of them. Neither are you. The observation wasn't comfort, just recognition. Becca was fighting not because she wanted to, but because she'd inherited Margaret's inability to stay silent in the face of theft dressed up as legitimacy. Catherine convened a strategy meeting in her office. Coleman Donald Miller, James Becca, and Brandon as observer. The evidence was strong, but not complete. They needed environmental impact, something that moved the case from property dispute to public health crisis. Water samples. Coleman spread maps across Catherine's desk. If Summit contaminated groundwater during extraction, that's federal environmental crime. EPA involvement changes everything. Brandon volunteered to coordinate sample collection, quietly, without alerting Summit or their lawyers. 14 wells within 2 miles of the Hayes property, tested by an independent lab in Knoxville. Donald Miller offered to reach out to other former workers. Now that I've come forward, some might talk. 35 years of operations, a lot of people saw things they were told to ignore. The plan took shape. Build the case so overwhelming that Summit had no defense force them to settlement or face criminal prosecution that would destroy them. Then Emily didn't come home from school. Becca got the call at 3:45. Principal Wallace's voice tight with barely controlled panic. A man came to the office. Said he was from your lawyer's office here to pick Emily up early. Becca's vision tunneled. I didn't send anyone. We realized that when we called to confirm, the school's in lockdown, Emily's safe, but the man fled before we could detain him. Agent Voss arrived before Becca did, had already reviewed security footage. The man matched descriptions of Gary Mercer, a private investigator with a history of corporate dirty work. Known for intimidation, surveillance, evidence tampering. This crossed a line. Voss's voice was cold professional. Attempted kidnapping of a minor in a federal investigation. I'm recommending immediate protective custody. Emily was white-faced and shaking when Becca found her in the principal's office, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm room. They tried to take me, but they didn't. You're safe. For how long? The question hung unanswered. Catherine presented the choice with brutal clarity that evening. We can continue, but Emily goes into protective custody with U.S. Marshals until trial. Or you take whatever settlement Summit offers, and this ends today. Becca looked at her daughter. 10 years old should be worried about homework and friendships, not kidnapping attempts and federal protection. We keep fighting. But Emily goes somewhere safe. Emily's eyes widened. You're sending me away. Just for a little while, until this is over. The foster placement happened within 24 hours. A family in Knoxville, vetted by the marshals, experienced with witness protection cases. Emily went with a single bag, looking back at her mother with eyes that held betrayal and understanding in equal measure. Becca watched the car drive away and felt something inside her crack. The cost of fighting was supposed to be personal, not something she forced her daughter to pay. The fire started at 2 in the morning. Becca woke to the smell of smoke, wrong smoke, chemical, and aggressive. Through the bedroom window, she could see flames rising from the direction of the stone building, 50 feet high, orange turning night into terrible day. She called 911, then ran. James was already there trying to fight the blaze with buckets from the creek futile against the inferno's scale. Coleman appeared from the direction of his property half a mile east, Donald from the opposite direction. They formed a line passing buckets, but the heat drove them back, the intensity professional and deliberate. The volunteer fire department arrived 20 minutes later. By then, 40% of the building had collapsed. The remaining structure was unsalvageable, the stone walls cracked from heat, the interior reduced to ash and twisted metal. But 60% of the crates had survived. The core samples Becca had removed were safe in Catherine's office. Donald's ledger, Linda's letters, Coleman's analysis, all preserved. The evidence was diminished, but not destroyed. The state fire investigator worked through the morning photographing burn patterns, collecting samples. He found the gasoline can in the underbrush barely concealed. Size 13 boot prints in the mud, the same tread pattern that had marked Becca's kitchen floor. Tire tracks where a vehicle had parked 50 yards away, close enough to monitor but far enough to avoid the blaze spreading to forest. Professional arson. He delivered the assessment to Agent Voss without inflection, timed for maximum damage to structure minimal risk of wildfire. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Voss arrived as they were bagging evidence, her face set in grim satisfaction. "We found Gary Mercer. Phone records show 47 calls to Summit's main number last month. Wire transfer of $25,000 from a Summit Consulting account to Mercer's LLC 3 days before the fire." She laid out the evidence methodically. Boot prints that matched Mercer's military service records, gasoline can with partial fingerprints, cell tower data placing him near the property the night of the arson, enough for federal charges. Arson, witness intimidation, attempted kidnapping, conspiracy. "I'm recommending prosecution." Catherine's response was immediate. "This strengthens our civil case enormously, proves malicious intent, establishes a pattern of criminal conduct. Juries send messages to corporations that think they're above the law." But she pulled Becca aside, later away from the others. Criminal trial, first, then civil. 18 months minimum for criminal appeals, could add 2 years. Civil can't proceed until criminal concludes. You're looking at 4 to 5 years total. 5 years of Emily in protection. Catherine's honesty was brutal. Maybe. Or Summit realizes criminal exposure makes settlement cheaper than fighting. Board members panic when they face personal liability. The pressure arrived faster than expected. Summit stock dropped 8% over 3 trading days as news of the FBI investigation leaked to financial reporters. The CEO faced hostile questioning during a CNBC interview about alleged criminal activities in Tennessee operations. Shareholders filed demands for independent board investigation, the kind of internal review that started friendly and turned vicious when numbers didn't align with official statements. Coleman's water testing results arrived the same week. 14 wells sampled, 9 showed elevated lithium arsenic and heavy metals, levels exceeding EPA safety standards by margins that suggested decades of contamination. Families had been drinking poisoned water without knowing, while Summit extracted millions in profit from the land that poisoned them. Brandon published preliminary findings in the Gazette. Hidden cost of mining groundwater, contamination affects dozens. The story went regional within hours, picked up by Nashville and Chattanooga papers. Community outrage shifted. People who'd blamed Becca for threatening jobs now realized Summit had poisoned them while stealing from their neighbors. Kenneth Thompson had his well tested, contaminated. He showed up at the house 3 days later, Ashley in tow. "I owe you an apology. You weren't just fighting for yourself. Ashley and Emily could be friends again, a small victory that felt enormous against the weight of everything else. Stephen Walsh called for an emergency meeting. Coffee shop in Knoxville, neutral ground away from courthouses and official records. He arrived alone. No junior attorneys, no paralegal. Exhaustion had carved lines into his face that hadn't been there at the dismissal hearing. Board is panicking. FBI investigation, EPA investigation, class action lawsuits forming. They want this contained, then accept our terms from 3 months ago. Walsh's jaw tightened. I can't. Not all of them. Admission of wrongdoing scholarship fund board won't approve. Then we go to trial. Let discovery expose everything. Discovery is mutual. We'll subpoena every aspect of your client's life. Employment history, eviction records, CPS evaluations. We'll paint her as an opportunist exploiting a dead grandmother. Becca spoke before Catherine could. Do it. Drag me through whatever mud you want. I've got nothing left to lose except my daughter, and you already tried taking her. Walsh flinched. The attempted kidnapping hadn't been his idea, but he represented the people who'd approved it. $2.9 million. His voice dropped almost conciliatory. Mineral rights underground, only surface protected. No NDA you're free to discuss publicly. We fund a scholarship at $150, but don't attach Margaret's name officially. Catherine calculated silently. After taxes and my fee, you net approximately $1.4 million, enough for security, land protection, Emily's education. She turned to Becca. Or we go to trial. 60% chance we win significantly more. 40% chance we lose everything. Either way takes years. The coffee shop was nearly empty. Afternoon light slanted through windows, illuminating dust motes like they meant something. Becca thought about Emily in protective custody, asking when she could come home. About Margaret dying alone, vindicated only in death. About the families drinking contaminated water, the jobs that would be lost, the community that would fracture regardless of what she chose. This is the crossroad. Not the dramatic courtroom from movies, but a quiet booth calculating the cost of being right. Margaret fought 30 years, died without vindication. Becca can end this today, secure Emily's future, protect the land, walk away whole. Emily's in witness protection, scared, asking when she can come home. The money would bring her home today. Is that surrender? Or is it wisdom? Is compromise betrayal of Margaret? Or is it the same choice Linda made? Choosing your child over abstract justice. One more thing. Becca's voice was steady, clearer than she felt. One sentence in the settlement agreement. Walsh's suspicion was immediate. What sentence Summit Mining acknowledges off-lease drilling occurred on Hayes property between 1987 and 1991. Walsh's face went carefully blank. That single sentence is admissible in every other case, opens us to liability from adjacent property owners, costs millions in future settlements, then detonate it now or risk worse in full discovery. Criminal trial will expose everything anyway. This way, you control the narrative. The silence stretched. Walsh's coffee grew cold. Outside traffic moved past in the indifferent rhythm of a city that didn't care about negotiations happening in corner booths. Walsh made a phone call, mostly listened, his face tightening with each second. Hung up with movements that looked like defeat. They'll do it. One sentence buried in Section 22, subsection F. Factual acknowledgement, not admission of liability. Legal hair-splitting, that meant everything. The admission would survive in court records available to every family Summit had stolen from every landowner they'd violated. Settlement signing was scheduled for 3 days out. Brandon's investigation was complete. He'd waited as long as legal strategy allowed, but journalist ethics demanded publication. The truth had ripened enough to survive the backlash. The Gatlinburg Gazette front page went live at 6 a.m. 30 years of lies. How Summit Mining built an empire on stolen land and poisoned water. The story detailed everything: core samples, illegal drilling, Margaret's ignored warnings, Linda's buyout water contamination, internal memos showing executives knew they were drilling outside lease boundaries, George Blackwood's confession about being paid to discredit Margaret, Donald Miller's ledger with proof of off-lease extraction. Section 22F from the pending settlement quoted verbatim. The sentence Summit had fought to keep private, now public, before the ink dried. The article included interviews with Coleman Donald James families whose wells were contaminated. It painted Summit not as a corporation making mistakes, but as an organization that had systematically stolen, poisoned, and silenced for 3 decades. The story went viral. Nashville, Tennessean picked it up within 2 hours. Chattanooga Times Free Press by noon. Associated Press ran a condensed version by evening. Washington Post and New York Times followed with shorter pieces that focused on environmental justice and corporate accountability. Social media erupted, hashtags formed, Justice for Margaret trended regionally, then nationally. Summit stock plummeted another 8% in a single trading day. The CEO announced retirement effective immediately. The board retained outside counsel for internal investigation, and internal emails started surfacing in discovery for other cases. Executives discussing Hayes' property specifically, instructions to proceed despite lease boundaries, orders to manage Margaret Hayes quietly, approvals for payments to Gary Mercer, knowledge of intimidation tactics. Stephen Walsh's name appeared in the emails, instructions to manage the Hayes situation quietly, approval of Mercer payments, knowledge of the fire before it happened. The Tennessee Bar Association opened an investigation within 48 hours. Professional conduct violations, conspiracy to witness tampering, subornation of perjury in court filings that claimed core samples were forged when internal emails showed executives knew they were authentic. Walsh realized his career was ending before the investigation even concluded. The day before settlement signing, Walsh approached Becca outside Catherine's office. Alone, violating every protocol, desperation overriding professional judgment. "Miss Hayes, we need to talk, off record. Nothing about this is off record anymore." Walsh dropped the professional mask entirely. "You don't understand what you're destroying. Summit employs 200 families in this county, 200 children who eat because of paychecks you're eliminating. Your grandmother was a bitter old woman who couldn't accept the world changed. You're continuing her vendetta at the cost of people who never wronged you. They stole $200 million worth of resources from land they didn't own, poisoned water families drink. That's not vendetta, that's consequence." Walsh's voice dropped, took on an edge that was pure threat. "I'm offering you $500,000 cash. Today, right now. Walk away. We both forget this happened. That's bribe money. It's practical money." "Mountain roads are dangerous, Miss Hayes. Winter's coming. Accidents happen to people unfamiliar with terrain. Would be a terrible tragedy if Emily lost her mother before she even got her home back. The threat was naked desperate, the last play of someone with nothing left to lose. Becca pulled out her phone, showed him the screen. Recording active. Thank you for clarifying your position, Mr. Walsh. See you at signing tomorrow. Bring the full $2.9 million. Walsh's face drained of color. He walked away without another word. The recording went to Catherine and Agent Voss immediately. Federal charges added to Walsh's growing list. Attempted bribery of a witness. Intimidation. Threatening bodily harm. Summit's board received the recording through their outside counsel. Emergency session that night. Walsh was removed from the case, suspended pending investigation. A new attorney assigned for settlement signing. Walsh's career was over before the Bar Association even filed formal charges. The settlement signing happened in Catherine's office. Summit's new attorney, pale and professional, presented documents that had been reviewed by 3 different legal teams. $2.9 million. Section 22F included conservation easement funded, environmental remediation for contaminated wells, scholarship fund for $200,000. Becca signed with hands steadier than expected. The wire transfer hit her account the next business day. $2,059,000 gross. Catherine took her contingency immediately. $680,000. Clean professional earned. Becca's net was $1,379,000. Life-changing money. More than she'd imagined having across a lifetime. But all she wanted was Emily home. The release from protective custody happened the same afternoon. Becca drove to Knoxville, picked up her daughter from the foster family who'd kept her safe for 6 weeks that felt like 6 years. Is it over? Can we go home? Yes, baby, we can go home. That evening, news broke nationally. Tennessee woman wins $2.9 million settlement from mining giant over illegal drilling. Media requests flooded in. 60 Minutes, CNN and NPR wanted interviews. Catherine advised carefully. Control your narrative. Do one major interview, then step back. Becca agreed to Amanda Foster from the Nashville Tennessean. The interview published 3 days later. The woman who proved her crazy grandmother right. Sympathetic, powerful, focused on Margaret's lonely fight and Becca's determination to finish it. The story went viral for the second time. But viral didn't mean victory. Gatlinburg remained divided. Half saw Becca as a hero who'd exposed corporate theft. Half saw her as the person who'd destroyed 200 jobs. Spray paint appeared on Catherine's office building. Hayes killed our jobs. Hateful letters to the editor blamed Becca for economic damage. Online harassment escalated. Facebook groups formed specifically to vilify her. Becca realized winning the lawsuit hadn't won the community. Margaret's isolation now belonged to her. The cost of justice wasn't just legal fees and fear. It was becoming the person neighbors crossed the street to avoid the name spoken with contempt by people whose suffering was real, even if their anger was misdirected. Emily came home changed, quieter, more watchful, carrying trauma that would take years to process. She woke screaming 3 nights that first week, trapped in nightmares about men coming through windows. Becca held her daughter and wondered if she'd chosen right. Margaret's vindication felt hollow against the weight of Emily's fear. Some victories she was learning didn't feel like winning. They just felt like survival with a price tag nobody mentioned in the settlement agreement. The first thing Becca bought was new boots for Emily. Not thrift store specials held together with duct tape, but real winter boots with insulation and traction. Then a coat that actually fit warm enough for mountain winters. They stood in the Target checkout line like regular people, not counting pennies, not calculating whether they could afford soap and food in the same transaction. Emily held a stack of books she'd chosen herself, fantasy novels about girls who saved kingdoms and tamed dragons. Can I really get all of these? All of them, and more if you want. The smile that crossed Emily's face was the first genuine joy Becca had seen in months. Small things, normal things, the luxury of not measuring every purchase against survival. In the bathroom, Becca locked the stall and cried, not from sadness, but from the release of pressure she'd carried so long it had become part of her skeleton. The money couldn't buy back Emily's stolen childhood or erase the nightmares, but it could build something new. Foundation instead of quicksand. Catherine's financial breakdown arrived 2 days later, handwritten on yellow legal pad paper, numbers organized with the precision of someone who understood that sudden wealth destroyed people who didn't respect it. $220,000 for complete house renovation. Professional contractors, permits everything to code. $60,000 for barn construction plus ongoing care for rescue horses. $150,000 into an irrevocable trust for Emily's education, enough for undergraduate and graduate degrees with inflation adjustment built in. $250,000 for conservation easement through Tennessee Land Trust. Locks the property, forever prevents any future development or extraction. $200,000 emergency savings in FDIC-insured accounts. $500,000 in diversified investments. 60% index funds, 40% bonds. Boring and safe. Remaining funds for living expenses until you reestablish your nursing career. Catherine looked up from the pad. This gives you security without making you wealthy enough to be reckless. You'll need to work eventually. Your license is still valid, but not desperately. Emily grows up stable. The land stays protected forever. Becca studied the numbers. Eleanor would approve of the boring safety. Margaret had fought for principle, but she'd also fought so her family wouldn't have to keep fighting. This was finishing that work. The story leaked 3 days after signing. Someone Brandon suspected George Blackwood trying to atone sent the full settlement agreement to the Wall Street Journal. The headline was "Brutal Mining Giant Settles Illegal Drilling Case Admits Decades of Trespass." The article detailed core samples, Margaret's 30-year fight, Section 22F's admission about off-lease drilling water contamination affecting dozens of families, the settlement amount, the scholarship fund. Everything Summit had tried to keep quiet now broadcast to shareholders and the public. CNN picked it up within hours. NPR ran a segment. The story became a national conversation about corporate accountability, environmental justice, the cost of being right when powerful institutions preferred you silent. Summit stock dropped 15% in 2 trading days. The CEO's retirement became a public scandal. Board members faced hostile shareholder meetings, demanding explanations for how systematic theft had continued for 3 decades without oversight. Internal emails leaked, showing the cover-up went deeper than anyone had suspected. Not just Hayes property, but 6 other landowners Summit had drilled on without permission. 30 years of illegal extraction protected by executives who approved the theft and paid to silence anyone who noticed. Stephen Walsh's name appeared repeatedly. Approvals for intimidation tactics, knowledge of Gary Mercer's activities before the fire, instructions to manage the Hayes situation by any means necessary. The Bar Association's investigation accelerated. Within 2 months, findings were released: professional misconduct, conspiracy to witness tampering, subornation of perjury, attempted bribery. Walsh was disbarred permanently, law license revoked, career ended with bureaucratic finality. Criminal charges followed separately: witness intimidation, attempted bribery, threatening bodily harm. The recording of his final threat to Becca became key evidence, undeniable proof of intent. Plea deal offered 18 months federal prison. Walsh took it, understanding a trial would result in far worse. Becca learned about the sentencing from a newspaper article, expected to feel triumph or vindication. Instead, she felt the quiet recognition that consequences eventually found everyone, even people who thought themselves immune. She saw him 6 months later. Pure chance, Knoxville street corner. Walsh was leaving a commercial real estate office carrying a cardboard box of personal belongings. His face had hollowed beard stubble, suggesting he'd stopped caring about professional appearance. Their eyes met for 3 seconds. He looked away, first walked past, without acknowledgement. That moment, not the courtroom drama or public shaming, felt like the real ending. Just a man who'd wielded power carelessly, discovering it could be taken away. Some victories looked nothing like winning. They just looked like people getting smaller as they walked away. Within 7 days of the settlement becoming public, 7 families from surrounding counties came forward. Each had stories about Summit, suspicious drilling, trespassing surveyors, warnings they'd dismissed as paranoia until Becca's case proved the pattern was real. All of them cited Section 22F in their filings. That single sentence Becca had insisted on became legal precedent, the key that unlocked dozens of cases Summit had thought safely buried. Catherine was approached to represent the class action. She declined citing conflict of interest, but recommended a colleague and helped coordinate the filings. Summit faced liability exceeding $100 million across all pending cases. Becca's settlement looked small by comparison. She'd opened floodgates, and the water rushing through would drown the company that had stolen with impunity for 3 decades. Brandon wrote a follow-up piece, The Sentence That Changed Everything: How One Admission Unleashed Flood of Claims. Gary Mercer's trial was swift. Federal charges for arson, witness intimidation, attempted kidnapping. Overwhelming evidence. Phone records, wire transfers, boot print matches. Gasoline can with his fingerprints. 15 years minimum if convicted. His lawyer negotiated a plea. 10 years medium security in exchange for testimony implicating Summit executives who'd hired him. Justice served, Becca thought when she heard, but it didn't undo the terror Emily had experienced, didn't erase the nights her daughter still woke screaming. Mercer's testimony triggered more indictments. 3 Summit executives charged with conspiracy. The legal machinery ground slowly but thoroughly, dismantling the structure that had protected corporate theft for decades. Summit Mining announced operational restructuring 3 months post-settlement, closing all Tennessee facilities, relocating operations to Nevada under new management, and a rebranding effort that fooled nobody. 212 workers received termination notices. The Gatlinburg economy took immediate damage. $3.2 million in annual tax revenue disappeared. Local businesses that had relied on Summit workers, restaurants, mechanics, retail shops, felt the impact within weeks. The resentment toward Becca intensified among some. Spray paint appeared on walls near her property. Graffiti that blamed her by name for jobs, lost families struggling the economic hole. Summit's departure created. The grocery store owner refused to serve her. When Becca entered, he simply pointed to the door. "Not welcome here. You made your choice, now live with it." Online harassment escalated. Facebook groups dedicated to vilifying her. Hateful messages claiming she'd destroyed the community for personal profit. People who'd never met her deciding she was villain because villains were easier to hate than complex systems of corporate exploitation. But others defended her. Families whose wells had been contaminated. Environmental groups celebrating corporate accountability. People who remembered Margaret's warnings and felt ashamed they hadn't listened. The community fractured. Neighbor against neighbor, families divided. Some saw Becca as hero who'd exposed theft and poisoning. Others saw her as the person who'd eliminated 200 paychecks. Justice Becca learned didn't mean everyone was happy. It often meant nobody was. Emily got bullied at school, shoved in the hallway by a classmate whose father had worked Summit's processing plant, called names, blamed for things a 10-year-old had no control over. Ashley Thompson stopped talking to her. Her father, Kenneth, had found new work, ironically, on environmental cleanup crews, remediating contaminated wells, but the friendship couldn't survive the pressure. Emily came home crying one afternoon. "I lost my only friend because of us." Becca had no comfort to offer, just held her daughter and felt the weight of choices that hurt the people you loved even when they were right. 6 months later, Kenneth approached Becca at the library. Ashley beside him, quiet and nervous. "I owe you an apology. You weren't fighting us, you were fighting for all of us. I just couldn't see it through my fear of losing everything." He'd realized Summit had been poisoning his family for years. The job that fed them had also been killing them slowly. The anger had been easier than gratitude, but time and clean water had shifted his perspective. Ashley can be friends with Emily again, if Emily wants. The girls reconciled tentatively. Their friendship rebuilt slowly, different than before, carrying the weight of understanding that right and wrong weren't simple categories, but complicated choices with costs nobody advertised. One afternoon, Ashley asked Emily a question that hurt because it was fair. Was it worth it? Your mom fighting Emily's answer came from somewhere deeper than 10 years should contain. "I don't know yet. Ask me when we're grown." Emily's nightmares persisted 8 months after settlement. She woke screaming about men at windows, people taking her fires, consuming everything safe. The terror was visceral, primal, immune to Becca's reassurances that the danger had passed. Dr. Carol Bennett, child psychologist in Knoxville, diagnosed PTSD with the gentle certainty of someone who'd seen this before. Emily experienced sustained threat during a developmentally critical period. Her brain formed neural pathways around fear and hypervigilance. This will take years of therapy. Some scars may never fully heal. Twice-weekly sessions began, EMDR therapy to process trauma, cognitive behavioral therapy to rebuild sense of safety, play therapy to access emotions Emily couldn't verbalize. Progress was slow, measured in tiny increments, sleeping through one night without waking, walking to the bus stop without looking over her shoulder constantly, reading a book without startling at every sound. But some damage was permanent. Emily developed anxiety triggers that Dr. Bennett explained might last a lifetime. Loud noises, unexpected visitors, dark sedans, men in suits. At 10 years old, she carried trauma that would shape who she became. The cost of Becca's choice etched into her daughter's nervous system. One night, Emily asked the question Becca had been dreading. "Mom, was it worth it? Me being scared so you could fight Becca's throat closed." "I don't know, baby. I thought I was protecting our future. Maybe I was protecting my pride. Grandma Margaret died alone. You didn't want that for her, no. But I didn't want this for you either, so there's no good answer." "No, sweetheart. Sometimes there isn't." Emily absorbed this, the complexity of adult choices, settling into understanding that would take years to fully process. Then she showed Becca her journal, the one Dr. Bennett had suggested for processing emotions. The entry was dated that afternoon. "I used to be scared all the time. Now I'm only scared sometimes. That's progress, I think. Mom asked if I'm angry she fought instead of taking the first money and keeping us safe. I'm not angry. I'm sad. Sad that someone had to choose between right and safe. Sad that Grandma Eleanor died alone. Sad that Ashley's dad lost his job. Sad that so many people hurt no matter what anybody chose. But I'm not sorry. If we'd taken the money and stayed quiet, I'd be sad about different things. At least this sadness has meaning." Becca read it 3 times, tears blurring the words. Her 10-year-old daughter understood complexity Becca still struggled with. Emily had paid the price of this fight, and she'd found meaning in the cost. That had to count for something. Becca's own struggle was quieter, less visible, but just as corrosive. After the settlement, after Emily came home after the immediate crisis passed, she felt lost. For 18 months, her entire identity had been fighting Summit. Every thought, every action, every choice organized around winning. Now the fight was over, and she didn't know who she was without it. Money was secured, land was protected, Margaret was vindicated, Emily was safe, or as safe as Becca could make her. But there was no job, few friends, a community that saw her as either hero or villain, with no middle ground. The isolation Margaret had endured now belonged to Becca. James noticed during one of his visits bringing firewood and company. Eleanor went through this after the county dismissed her 92 case, didn't know what to do with herself when the fight ended badly. Fighting was her purpose. Winning or losing took that away. What did she do? Found new battles. Environmental protection, water rights, helping other people fight their own fights. Never stopped till she died. James paused, choosing words carefully. Don't be her Becca. Find something beyond fighting. Life isn't just war. The advice was sound, but implementation was hard. Becca spent months drifting directionless, the adrenaline of battle replaced by the hollow ache of purposelessness. Eventually, she enrolled online to renew her nursing certification. 6 months of coursework to catch up on practice, changes new protocols, medical advances she'd missed during the homeless months and legal battle. The local clinic indicated interest in hiring her once certified. Regular work helping people using skills she'd trained for before everything fell apart. Slowly, painfully, she rebuilt identity separate from the lawsuit. Not Margaret's granddaughter, not the woman who fought Summit, just Becca, nurse, mother, person trying to live normally in a place that would never see her as normal. Pastor Daniel Cooper appeared on Becca's porch 4 months after settlement. 55, weathered in the way of mountain clergy who spent as much time on parishioners' porches as in pulpits. Communities divided. Half see you as hero, half as villain. Both sides hurting. Can't heal till we talk. He proposed community meetings. Neutral space, his church basement, for people to voice pain without judgment. Mediated conversations between those who blamed Becca and those who supported her. Becca was skeptical. They hate me. Some do. Others are ashamed they didn't believe Margaret. Hate and shame sound similar till you learn to tell them apart. The meetings began hesitantly. 10 people the first week, 20 the second. Voices raised, tears shed, anger expressed without violence. Kenneth Thompson spoke during the third meeting. I was wrong about you, but my fear wasn't wrong. I did lose my job. My family struggled. That pain is real, even if my anger was misdirected. George Blackwood confessed publicly what he'd already told Becca privately. I took Summit's money to discredit Margaret. I helped bury truth because I needed to save my daughter. That's on me, not on this community. Slowly, imperfectly, some healing occurred, not universal. Some people never forgave, never stopped blaming. But enough softened that living in the same town became possible instead of unbearable. Becca learned community wasn't monolithic. It was collection of individuals making individual choices, some generous, some bitter, most somewhere in between. The house transformation took 18 months. Professional contractors, proper permits, everything done right instead of shortcuts and hope. The metal roof, deep charcoal that would outlast generations, replaced sagging shingles. Triple pane windows, sealed against mountain winters. Modern electrical wiring brought the structure into current century. Solar panels on the south-facing slope generated enough power to sell excess back to the grid. The porch was rebuilt from pressure-treated lumber, solid and level. Fresh paint, warm cream color, made the exterior look intentional rather than accidental. Inside oak floors, refinished to honey glow. Kitchen counters upgraded to granite. Cherry cabinets replaced rough-hewn shelves. A modern heat pump provided consistent temperature, though Becca kept the old cast iron stove as decoration because Margaret would have appreciated the gesture. Emily's room received new everything, drywall insulation, a window that locked securely, but she chose to keep the iron bed frame, wanting connection to the grandmother she'd never met. The bathroom finally had hot water on demand and a shower that didn't require heating water on a stove first. The house was still recognizably Margaret's. The bones hadn't changed, but the structure had been loved back to life, made safe and warm and permanent. James helped with final touches, installing shelves and fixing minor details contractors missed. Eleanor would approve. Not of the fancy counters, she'd call those wasteful, but of you staying. That's what mattered to her. Someone caring enough to remain. The barn sat 50 yards from the house, 20 by 30 feet, rubber mat flooring that protected aging joints. Infrared heaters kept temperature above freezing even in January. Automatic waterers ensured fresh supply without hauling buckets. 3 rescue horses shared the space. An Appaloosa mare with a crooked foreleg saved from slaughter auction. A bay gelding 24 years old, too ancient for anyone to want. And Copper, the horse James had been caring for connection to Margaret, who'd ridden him in her stronger years. Emily spent hours with the horses, brushing coats, cleaning hooves, talking to them about things she couldn't tell humans. The animals didn't judge, didn't carry trauma, just existed in patient present tense. Becca watched her daughter with the mare and saw the first genuine peace Emily had experienced in over a year. Therapy helped, but the horses healed something words couldn't reach. The 3 of them stood in the paddock one morning, sunlight catching their coats, living proof that being unwanted wasn't permanent condition. Everything could be rescued if someone cared enough to try. The conservation easement finalized in March, 2 years after the settlement. $250,000 to Tennessee Land Trust in exchange for permanent protection. The 80 acres could never be developed, logged commercially, or mined. The agreement bound Becca Emily and every future owner in perpetuity. Summit's mineral rights acquired through settlement, then abandoned when they closed Tennessee operations, reverted to state ownership. The governor quietly had transferred them to Department of Conservation, ensuring they'd never be exploited. Becca stood on the property line with the land trust representative, a woman in her 30s who specialized in mountain conservation. This is forever, no loopholes forever. Your great-great-grandchildren could try to break this, courts would laugh them out. Some things once protected stay protected. One victory that was unambiguously good. The land Margaret had fought to defend would remain wild and whole long after everyone involved in this battle turned to dust. The stone building that burned was rebuilt, transformed into memorial through community effort that surprised Becca with its breadth. 50,000 from settlement funds, 30,000 in community donations, 20,000 from a state historical grant. People who'd known Margaret families whose water had been contaminated, students from the local high school, even some former Summit workers. We didn't know. We should have. The refrain repeated among donors, trying to make amends for decades of dismissing Margaret as crazy. Dr. Coleman, Donald Miller, and James supervised construction, installing a bronze plaque beside the entrance. Eleanor Margaret Hayes, 1941 to 2023. She told the truth before anyone profited from hearing it. Below smaller text. Some battles take generations. Some victories come too late. Neither makes the fight less necessary. Inside behind glass, 3 core samples sat in protected display. Donald's original ledger, a copy, the original in state archives. Timeline wall documenting Margaret's 30-year fight. County Commission minutes showing her dismissed 3 times. Linda's letter explaining her choice. Becca's settlement agreement with Section 22F highlighted. The Gatlinburg School District made it an official field trip destination. Sarah Mitchell, the librarian who'd helped find documents, led tours, explaining how corporations could harm communities and how one person with documentation could challenge power. Becca watched from the doorway during the first school visit. 4th graders curious and restless, listening to Sarah explain Margaret's story. One child asked the question that mattered. Was she really crazy? Sarah's answer came without hesitation. No, she was right. We just weren't ready to believe her. Sometimes the world calls people crazy because their truth is inconvenient. That doesn't make them wrong. The memorial didn't undo Margaret dying alone, didn't erase 30 years of being dismissed, but it changed the narrative from tragedy to testimony, from madness to prophecy. State legislator from Sevier County proposed a bill 6 months after settlement, named for Margaret, drafted with input from environmental groups and Catherine's legal expertise. The Eleanor Hayes Water Protection Act required all mining companies operating in Tennessee to disclose drilling activity within 1 mile of residential water sources, annual testing of wells, public reporting of results. Violations triggered criminal penalties and automatic license suspension. The bill passed Tennessee House 72 to 27. Senate 24 to 9. Governor signed it into law with ceremony that invited Becca as guest of honor. Your grandmother's persistence saved lives we'll never know about. This ensures her work continues. Becca gave brief remarks, uncomfortable with public speaking, but understanding the importance. She didn't fight to be a hero. She fought because lying down felt worse than standing up. That's all any of us can do. Margaret's name was now in Tennessee legal code, permanent, a protection that would outlast everyone who'd dismissed her, everyone who'd fought her, everyone who'd finally believed. The ripple effects continued. 11 families filed suits against Summit's successor companies over the next year, all cited Section 22F as precedent. That single sentence became foundation for cases in Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia. Environmental justice litigation that referenced Becca's settlement as proof corporations could be held accountable. Summit Mining declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Liability exceeded assets. The company restructured, emerged smaller, relocated operations to Nevada, rebranded under new management, but didn't dissolve. Just moved, waiting for memory to fade, for new places where they could extract without the baggage of Tennessee's exposure. Becca testified as expert witness in 3 subsequent cases. Didn't enjoy the experience, understood the responsibility. Margaret had fought alone. Becca wouldn't let others face the same isolation. Brandon wrote a book 2 years post-settlement. Truth Buried: How One Woman's 30-Year Fight Changed Environmental Law. Comprehensive account of Margaret's battle, Becca's continuation, the legal precedents that followed. He dedicated it simply for Margaret Hayes, who was right when it cost everything. Becca read it in 2 sittings, cried at the accuracy. Brandon had captured Margaret's loneliness perfectly, the weight of being right when everyone preferred you wrong. So here's the question nobody asks after the headlines fade. Was it worth it? Eleanor died alone, called crazy for 30 years. Linda chose her daughter over justice, lived with guilt until cancer took her. Becca won the case, secured the money, protected the land, but Emily has PTSD. The community's divided and 200 families lost paychecks. The water's cleaner now. The laws changed. Margaret's vindicated, but the costs were real, paid by real people who didn't deserve suffering. There's no equation for this, no spreadsheet that balances justice against childhood trauma, truth against economic stability. December evening, 2 years after settlement. Snow fell softly across Silverbrook Ridge. Becca and Emily sat on the rebuilt porch, hot chocolate steaming in the cold air. Below, Gatlinburg lights flickered through bare trees. Above, stars emerged as darkness deepened. Emily was 12 now, taller still, carrying wariness, but learning to set it down sometimes. Did Grandma Eleanor's secret really change things? Becca considered the question carefully, refusing easy answers. Summit gone from Tennessee, but operating in Nevada under different name. Water treatment systems installed for contaminated families, but damage already done to some. Land protected these 80 acres, while thousands more remained at risk. Law changed in Tennessee, offering no help to Kentucky or West Virginia. Margaret vindicated, but only after dying alone. It shook the part that needed shaking, reminded people that truth buried is still truth waiting. But was it worth what it cost? Ask me in 10 years. Maybe I'll know then. Emily had been writing in her journal the practice Dr. Bennett recommended, becoming habit. She showed Becca an entry from earlier that day. "I used to be scared all the time. Now I'm only scared sometimes." That's progress, I think. "I'm not angry," Mom fought. "I'm sad. Sad that someone had to choose between right and safe. Sad that so many people hurt no matter what anybody chose. But I'm not sorry. If we'd taken the money and stayed quiet, I'd be sad about different things. At least this sadness has meaning." Becca read it twice, throat tight. "Are we rich now?" The question came with innocence that broke her heart. Rich enough to keep land safe, rich enough to give you choices Eleanor and Linda never had. She thought about investment accounts, emergency fund scholarship trust, boring financial instruments that wouldn't make headlines but would protect Emily's future. But we're rich in something else. We get to know we finished her story. That counts. Becca's reflection came in quiet moments, usually late at night when Emily slept and the house settled around her. The journey from Nashville alleys to this porch seemed impossible, yet here they sat. The inheritance that had seemed like desperation had become vindication. The choice to fight when settlement money would have been easier, but honest accounting required admitting she wasn't sure she'd choose the same path knowing the full cost. She looked at Emily, PTSD that required ongoing therapy, innocence, stolen childhood, interrupted by adult battles, then at the Protected Land Memorial Building, changed law, vindicated grandmother. Right choices didn't automatically feel good. Fighting Summit had been right. It had also hurt everyone she loved. Both truths existed simultaneously, refusing to resolve into clean narrative. Some victories didn't feel like winning. They just felt like survival, with a price tag nobody mentioned in the settlement agreement. James visited that evening, stood on the porch with them, watching snow accumulate on trees. Eleanor would be proud, not of the money she'd call that secondary, of you staying, making it mean something. Did she die happy? James was quiet a long moment. No, she died knowing she was right, but that being right hadn't mattered much. That ate at her till the end. He looked at Becca directly. "But the night before she passed, we talked. She said someone would come, someone stubborn enough to finish it. I think she meant you. I'm not sure I finished anything, just moved it forward. That's all finishing ever is. Next generation takes it further. Emily will take it further than you." Emily, overheard, spoke from the doorway. "I don't want to fight companies. I want to study horses." James laughed, genuine and warm. "Then study horses. Let someone else do the fighting. You've earned peace." That's Eleanor's story, and Becca's, and Emily's. 3 generations of women who learned that truth costs more than silence, that justice isn't the same as happiness, and that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee feeling good about it afterward. But they did it anyway. Not because they were heroes, because lying down felt worse than standing up. Some people are built to surrender. The Hayes women weren't among them. Have you ever had to choose between what's right and what's safe? Between your family's peace and principle worth fighting for? Between honoring one person's sacrifice and protecting another's innocence? These stories aren't just about them. They're about all of us, the choices we make when every option hurts someone we love. Snow continued falling, accumulating in drifts that would be beautiful by morning. Emily leaned against her mother, safe, but changed, carrying scars that would shape who she became. "Can we stay here forever? As long as you want. This is ours, legally, spiritually, permanently, not just property." Connection to Margaret's stubbornness, Linda's sacrifice, Becca's refusal to be silenced, Emily's resilience through circumstances no child should endure. Inside, the warm house waited, solid structure that had survived abandonment and arson to become home. Outside, mountains held them with patient grip, ancient stone that had witnessed human struggles for millennia and would witness millennia more. They didn't judge, didn't demand, just offered possibility of belonging to people willing to accept their terms. Emily's voice was small against the snow-muffled silence. "Mom, do you think Grandma Eleanor knows we won? I don't know if dead people know anything, but I know she fought, hoping someone would finish it. We did that part, even though it hurt, especially because it hurt." Easy things don't need finishing. They sat watching snow transform the landscape, covering old scars with fresh white, the way nature moved forward without forgetting what came before. Becca understood now that some stories didn't end. They just accumulated layers, each generation adding weight and meaning to what previous generations built. Margaret had fought alone for 30 years. Linda had chosen her daughter over that fight. Becca had chosen to finish what Margaret started, knowing it would cost Emily pieces of childhood she'd never get back. And Emily would carry all of it forward, the trauma, the victory, the complicated legacy of women who chose truth over comfort. The mountains remembered what people tried to forget. And now, finally, so would everyone else, even if remembering came with a price nobody advertised in the settlement agreement. Some inheritances weren't land or money. They were unfinished battles and the stubborn refusal to let wrong become normal just because fighting felt hard. That was the real gift Margaret left, not 80 acres or core samples or evidence that won a case, but the understanding that silence was corrosion, that truth buried was still truth waiting, and that some fights mattered enough to hurt for. Becca pulled Emily closer, felt her daughter's heartbeat against her side, steady and strong, despite everything. They'd survived. The land was protected. Margaret was vindicated. Emily was scarred but whole. Not the ending Becca had imagined when she opened that probate envelope behind a Nashville diner, but the ending they'd earned through choosing hard, right over easy wrong again and again until the choosing became who they were. The snow fell, the mountains waited, and 3 generations of Hayes women, one dead, one scarred, one still learning what she'd inherited, rested in the knowledge that truth, however painful, was worth the cost of telling.